Hello, Katie. Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us on your debut appearance here on System Update. I know you're a little nervous, so we want to see what we can get on you.
Thank you so much for having me. Let's get ready to rumble.
Yeah, let's exactly. Pun very appreciated. So I was just talking about your trajectory and how I see it as a microcosm of kind of the collapse of the need to work for places that require partisan orthodoxy and the ability to kind of find a much better place, not even an equal one, in independent media. I mean, you are sort of the kind of fairy tale case of how that works. But for people who aren't familiar with your past and the difficulty you had working within LeftWing Media and the success you've been able to find in independent media, just talk a little bit about your experience working with media institutions and how you've been liberated from that.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I was a staff writer at The Stranger, which is Seattle's alt-weekly. And I started there in 2017. I was a freelancer, and I wrote a piece about detransitioners. And the reaction to that piece sort of set the tone.
Well, what are
for my tenure
detransitioners?
there. People who transition and then decide that they've made a mistake for whatever reason. So an increasing population. At the time, detransitioners were sort of hard to find, but now you can look at the front page of the New York Times or the Atlantic and find them. And the reaction to the piece was very heated, both online and off. There was as you would expect, the typical online campaign to get me deplatformed and all of that, unsuccessful. And then offline, it got weirder because Seattle is a city where people they don't cotton well to people who think differently, I think is the best way to put it. And so people made stickers and posted them around the city, calling me a TERF or a transphobe or a Jordan Peterson apologist. That was very humiliating. At one point, somebody made a sticker with a picture of my face calling me a Nazi, but they used a cute picture, so I didn't mind that one that much. And they burned stacks of the paper and sent me video of it. The whole thing was very bizarre because the piece itself was very measured and it was pro-adult transition. It was just about this emerging phenomenon. And it was about something that is happening. I was doing my job as a reporter just to bring the news, bring people's stories to the world. And after that, I got hired. I got hired by the paper, much to their credit. And I think part of that was because of the outcry and the way that I handled it. I think my bosses, the publisher, and some editors were impressed that I refused to apologize. But among my colleagues, it really did set the tone for the way that I think I was looked at. And I was looked at as sort of a pariah within the organization. And then I got laid off during COVID. I took a voluntary furlough that turned into a permanent layoff, and I started this podcast with Jesse Singal. And of course, I work with the biggest transphobe chaser, the most annoying man in the world. So yes, we do make more money and we do have absolute freedom, but is it really worth it, Glenn? Is it?
To sell your soul. Well, the thing that interests me before we get into kind of the content of these issues, the ones on which you work, the ones I want to talk to you about, I find your politics outside of like a handful of issues to be kind of like almost annoyingly normie. Like I remember the one episode of yours that I just couldn't get through without wanting to murder both of you was you did an episode urging everybody with all your heart and soul to go to the polls and elect Joe Biden and make sure that he defeats Donald Trump. So how is it that both of you, or to speak for yourself, you in particular, have become, kind of far-right Nazis, fascists, and the like, given, your what should be the litmus test for where you fall on the spectrum, which is whether you supported Joe Biden or Donald Trump in the 2020 election?
Yeah, we are both milquetoast liberals. We have. If you
didn't
like us because we are thought criminals, you would hate our politics. But yeah, it's this one issue. I mean, there are other issues. I was more critical of Me Too than I think most people were at the time, because I think most people in the media were scared to say things like, "Wait a second, maybe due process is actually a value that those of us in the media should hold dear." And so there's been some culture war issues where we have fallen out of mainstream left. But this issue in particular, this is the one that once you are written into the trans book of the damned, as you know, it is nearly impossible to get out, despite what you actually believe. And in my case, I believe that these issues are complicated, but I also do believe in equal rights for trans people. I do think that we need to be able to debate issues of public policy, specifically around kids and sports and single-sex spaces. And I think we should be able to have these conversations, but this issue in particular gets you sort of written off as a bigot in polite society.
Well, before we get into that issue, and we're going to spend the bulk of our time talking about that, it's interesting you mentioned the kind of excesses of Me Too and the critique you made of those excesses, because the critique of Me Too at the time from you, as I recall it, certainly from most of the people to whom I was listening and the one that I shared myself, was based in nothing more than due process, which is you can't go around vilifying people, destroying their lives, branding them forever with reputational destroying titles based solely on often vague accusations, not even very specific ones, without providing at least some opportunity to contest them, some opportunity to determine if there's evidence to corroborate them, because that's too much power in the hands of accusers. And like all humans, that's fundamental to our society, power can be abused. Were you surprised that a basic value like due process ended up generating so much hostility in left liberal politics?
I wasn't surprised because this came after the detransition debacle. And then, so of course, I wasn't really surprised in 2020 when questioning the narrative of Black Lives Matter and whatever was the cause du jour was also treated with equal distaste from the sort of mainstream liberal tastemakers. I do think that that most people, and this includes people in the media, tend to be followers. And it is very hard to be, as you know, although I think you're sort of temperamentally inclined to enjoy it, it is hard, or it can be hard for us normal folks, unlike you, to stand up and be the person to say, wait a second, something's wrong here. And I think part of the benefit of being independent is that I don't have the internal pressures of having colleagues sort of look at me sideways in the break room, or the external pressures of having advertisers or platforms tell me what is or is not socially acceptable.
Well, it's interesting that you suggest that I'm some form of a sociopath who doesn't have normal human emotions, or that I'm immune to the kind of like very intense and ugly attacks that this issue singularly produces, because in fact, I tend to avoid spending a lot of time on the trans debate, not because I don't find it interesting, but because I'm often focused on other things, but also in part because it is so toxic, and there's only so much toxicity that even I can take. I think the one time I really dove in was totally at your provocation, when you'll probably recall you sent me some polling data by DM, knowing that I would comment it, and I did, and I trended for 3 days as a transphobe. But other than that, I really haven't spent much time on it, whereas you have made it one of the kind of focal points of your work. Why is that? What is it about that issue that interests you so much and that causes you to spend so much time on it?
Well, first let me say thank you, Glenn, for being the person. If I feel too chicken to comment on something, I can send it to you and know with almost certainty that you will take the bait.
I use Michael Tracy for that, by the way.
Yeah, if it's too toxic for me and it's too toxic for you, then Michael Tracy is the person to go to.
Exactly.
I do think that there's something inherently interesting about this particular issue. This is something that has captured the imagination of many people in the press and in the culture. There is something inherently, I think, interesting about whether or not it is possible to change sex and the stories about people who try to do that. There's something about that. But more to the point, as a journalist and as a commentator, I am troubled by, and I think this is changing somewhat, I think the vibe has shifted a little bit, but I am troubled by being told or pressured into not saying something and not covering something. And so for me, in a situation like this, if I feel a lot of pressure not to speak up, that is when I am most likely to do it. And there's been a lot of bad reporting and misreporting, disinformation, as our friends at MSNBC might call it, on this issue. And so as somebody who is naturally inclined to be a debunker, and as I think I am, this is a really rich avenue for it, because so much of the reporting on this has been so egregiously bad over the last few years.
You know, I remember one of the kind of eye-opening moments I had about the lack of necessary debate on this topic was a couple of people, I think you might have been one of them, but around the same time sent me some articles from medical studies and the like on just how complicated and difficult these gender transitioning surgeries are, how often they go wrong, how even when they don't go wrong, they present enormous amounts of difficulties for the people who seek to undergo them. They're very crude and primitive is the science, but there's obviously a lot of financial gain to be had in encouraging people to get it. It's a gigantic industry now. And I know, as somebody who follows this issue quite a bit, as a journalist who's, has the time to follow issues and read about them, I was kind of shocked to discover how kind of arduous and how wrong these surgeries can go sometimes. And even when they don't go wrong, the difficulties they present. It left me wondering how many parents or how many people who decide to pursue these are aware of that, because they haven't really been well discussed in the media. What are some of the issues, if that is that one that you can include it, that you think have been inadequately debated and covered?
Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it. So when you're talking about surgeries, specifically, there's a lot of complications with phalloplasty, which is the creation of a phallus, of a neopenis. There are also complications with vaginoplasty, but I think it is apparently, as they say, easier to create a hole than a pole. And one of the problems
who says
with
that?
this is
Who's they? Who says that?
People. Everybody says that.
Okay.
I think you learned that in medical school.
Yeah.
And one of the problems with this, it's not as though there is an actual, I think, blacklist when it comes to this issue, but I think a lot of outlets are really, really hesitant to report on things like complications, because it is seen as an attack on trans people, because it's seen as an attack on trans healthcare, and it's seen as a way of gatekeeping, right? But if you are someone who actually cares about trans people and cares about the outcomes and wants to see positive outcomes, then really you should be reporting on this. There should be pressure on surgeons to do a better job. And when things go wrong, it should be a story. I haven't reported too much on surgical outcomes. There are, as you can imagine, lots of barriers to that for lots of reasons, HIPAA being one of them. And it's hard to get doctors to talk about things like that. But there are other issues, things like childhood transition, pediatric transition, the use of puberty blockers. Activists constantly lie about puberty blockers. They say that they are 100% reversible. They minimize the side effects. Both of those things are false. There are lots of side effects of taking puberty blockers. Kids who take puberty blockers and then go on to take cross-sex hormones, some of them may never orgasm in their life. And I know that's not personally a big deal in your life, Glenn, but I think for
other people, other normal, healthy people, that may be a concern.
Yes.
You mentioned before you thought the vibe was changing a little bit. There was an article, I think, 3 or 4 weeks ago that amazingly provoked all sorts of hatred and scorn from trans activists about that very fact, that puberty blockers, which is a medication by definition given to prepubescent children who suffer from gender dysphoria, or who think they do, so we're talking about 11, 12 years old, maybe 13, that there have been very few studies on the long-term benefits and dangers of this medication for children who are given it that young and for that purpose. And there was a kind of first study that suggested that at the very least, there's a high likelihood that puberty blockers will compromise bone density, so that pretty early in life, people who take them will start to experience brittle bones break very easily, spinal problems and the like. There was just an article yesterday or today about how often now there are schools that are allowing kids as young as 10 or 11 to be referred to by a different name or a different gender purposely without telling their parents that this is happening, let alone seeking parental notification. Each time this happens, even though it's so evidently something we ought to be debating as a society, I mean, I know I'd be enraged if my children's school decided to switch my kid's name and gender without bothering to give me a call and let me know that was happening. What do you see that as kind of a sign that there's a little bit more opening up of this debate? And if so, what explains that?
Yeah, I do think that there are some signs that things are changing. The New York Times didn't report anything critical of trans ideology, for lack of a better term, for several years, and I think that has shifted in recent years. Specifically, that piece that you're talking about that was published a couple days ago. I have some quibbles of it, but I'm used to in the mainstream media and the liberal media, this being an issue that is treated as black and white. And outlets are, I think, are seeing, or at least acknowledging, that it isn't black and white, and that there's lots of nuance here, and that it's important to really get to the heart of the issue. And part of that, I think, is because they have seen that in other places, like in the UK and in parts of Scandinavia, these countries that have, in other situations, have healthcare systems that a lot of us on the left would emulate, are reversing course or slowing down on things like pediatric transition, because they have looked at the data and they have concluded that the data that childhood transition or things like puberty blockers is not that strong in terms of positive outcomes. And so I think part of it is just catching up with the science. I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think part of it is just that. I think part of it is also that things have shifted a little bit in terms of, I don't know, you can look at the success of people like Jesse Singal, who I hate to admit is more successful than I am with his newsletter. Jesse actually had a piece published in the New York Times last week, so he has not been totally kicked out of corporate media. But people have seen that you can make a career out of doing good reporting on this issue. And I think that some of these outlets are just catching up, and they're seeing that, there might be some backlash online, but long term, if you ignore the issue, if you pretend this thing doesn't happen, history is not going to judge them well. And it's also, one outlet publishes a piece and then the other outlets say, okay, look, the New York Times did it, or the Atlantic did it, or the AP is reporting on this, the BBC is reporting it. They're I think most editors are basically cowards, and you need to see someone else do the thing before you're willing to do the thing.
Absolutely. I know this is going to be a shock to a lot of people in the audience. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.